Now, the historian who comes to honor the memory of Father Alexander can only answer this mighty challenge by a humble offering, by a lecture that does not offer the view of some splendid freeway, some king's highway cut through the past, but rather by offering an account of a particular stretch of the rugged, rolling road which she or he has come to love and to study, with all its dust and potholes, with its splendid views, frustrating detours and perilous bends, along which we know the Church travelled in its time. And few rulers have set in motion changes of such momentous consequences for the future of the Church as those associated with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity in 312 and his subsequent halting of the persecution of the Christians that was ratified in what we now call the Edict of Milan of 313. Indeed, an air of somewhat eerie grandeur has come to surround the person of the first Christian emperor. From the medieval legend of the cry of the angel, Hodie venenum effusum est in ecclesiam Christi, today poison has been poured into the Church of Christ. The cry from a medieval Latin author provoked by the legendary donation of Constantine to the Pope, up to the very present, many theologians have held that some mysterious change for the worse in the entire quality of Christianity, such as persons of an earlier age would have been content to ascribe to supernatural agents such as the devil or Antichrist, appear to have been summed up in the person of this one somewhat flashy Roman emperor. I mean flashy. The historian must remind you, as part of his description of this rocky road, that Constantine was remembered in Gaul 150 years later, in the age of Attila the Hun, no less. Not as we might expect for his relations with the Christian Church, but for the fact that he had invented a type of hair cream that enabled him to keep his diadem in the correct position on his head. A shiny brilliantine known in those days as Constantine's cream. But even scholars of less apocalyptic or messianic temperament, the figure of Constantine does remain absolutely central. Faced by almost any legacy of the late antique world of which we happen to disapprove, and certainly for modern Western Christians there are many such features: anti-Semitism, the secular power of the Church, the rise of intolerance, the spirit of the Crusades, we tend to blame it all on Constantine. Indeed, for a significant strand of late Roman and early Christian studies, it seems that if Constantine did not exist, it would have been necessary to invent him. Now, this evening, I want to cut this overcharged image of the first Christian emperor down to human size. I want to do this by asking a simple question. What did Constantine himself and the Christians of his age think of the future of Christianity? What would it be? What should it be? What were for them the horizons of the possible? And so what would they settle for as the measure of success? I've done this because I want to break what strikes me increasingly as a logjam in Constantinian studies. We've become increasingly certain that Constantine was indeed a Christian. The Christianity of Constantine has been taken for granted. But do we really know the Christianity of Christianity? Do we know what was the image of the future, what was thinkable, what was unthinkable in the Christianity of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries? Or in our interpretation of the utterances and actions of Constantine, are we projecting back onto the expectations of the Christianity of his age, images of a Christian future which belong in fact to a later period? Now, for this reason, I will turn away from Constantine for much of this lecture to a well-known figure, to Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea from 313 to 339 or 340. I do this not because of his relations with Constantine, which may have been less intimate and frequent than we had once thought, than because Eusebius himself put himself out to be eminently representative. For 1/4 of a century, Eusebius presided over the think tank connected with the monumental library of the great Origen at Caesarea. In the words of Jean Cyrenelli, he considered that it was his vocation to act as the archivist of Christendom. And for this reason alone, he represented at least one major constellation of opinion among the bishops of the Greek East. So let us turn to Eusebius. What can we find from his capacious works of his own view of the history and possible future of Christianity? First of all, what did Eusebius think about the expansion of Christianity up to his own time? And so what did he think might be the future of this expansion? On the surface, the answer is obvious. Christianity was a universal religion. Since the coming of Christ and the first mission of the apostles, it appeared to him that Christianity had spread with miraculous speed to all nations and to all peoples. The phrase, "to all nations and to all peoples," runs as a triumphant refrain through his works. But what did Eusebius mean by this? It's perhaps not quite what we expect. Eusebius was genuinely convinced that anybody could become a Christian anywhere. There were now Christians at the edges of his known world, in barbarian lands such as Persia, Armenia, the Indian Ocean, as well as scattered all over the Roman Empire. Of that he was proud. In many ways, Eusebius's view of the world was like the map which can be found on the website of Starbucks. On this map, huge stretches of our planet, not least the whole of China, are marked green. For in these regions, Starbucks has arrived. What the map does not assert, though in a world of modern business we can assume that its might as might hope, was that every inhabitant of China was going sooner or later to go to a Starbucks. This map actually conveys a different message. The worldwide extension, if only for the lucky few who, for instance, live near the tourist zone outside the Forbidden City in Beijing, the miraculous possibility of a good cup of coffee. It's the same for Eusebius. It's vital for him to show that anybody, anywhere could become a Christian. It was less important to him that in any one place, least of all in all places, everyone would become a Christian. What we're looking at is what we might call a thin universalism. It's not a vertical universalism. It's a universalism which does not yet find room in the imagination for what I would call a majoritarian Christianity. Now, with this, we come up against the first silent but definitive restriction on the horizon of the possible of a Christian of the late 3rd and 4th century. They could think of Christianity as a universal religion, but not necessarily as a majority religion. What caused this imaginative block? I would suggest that this was because Eusebius's views on the spread of Christianity were anchored to the template of a very ancient debate. And this debate had less to do with the fortunes of Christianity on earth as with the power of the stars in heaven. It concentrated on the freedom of individual choice in a world apparently ruled by inflexible local customs, which in turn, according to the astrologers, betrayed the overwhelming power of the stars. Eusebius simply applied to the worldwide spread of Christianity ancient arguments against the astrologers' pictures of a human race frozen by the power of the stars. Eusebius followed closely, therefore, the arguments first framed in Rhetoric in around 220 AD in the Book of the Laws and Countries by the disciples of the Syrian philosopher and maverick Christian Bardaisan of Edessa. Bardaisan and his disciples had urged that the very fact that the customs of the nations surveyed across the globe from Ireland to China were so very different one from the other showed that they could not have been caused by universal stellar influences. For Bardaisan, each set of customs was the voluntary creation of a specific human community, undetermined by the stars. The China had opted to be a utopia of virtue, with neither thieves nor prostitutes. The Persians, however, had opted to sleep with their mothers, and Irishmen, I blush for my compatriots, were known to have favoured gay marriages at that time. This was potentially a subversive doctrine. It meant that, created by free will, the customs of society could also be changed and undone by free will. Only the uneducated thought that such customs were immovable, as if decreed by fate. Hence a possibility that was particularly thrilling to Christians of the 3rd century and of Eusebius's own age. Within each society, a group might arise that could choose freely to live by its own laws. No inscrutable necessity compelled them to obey the customs of their region. Each chooses a life for himself, writes Eusebius, according to his own free will, not imitating his neighbour except when he chooses. Hence the worldwide extension of those who had freely chosen to live by the laws of the Messiah, the laws of Christ. And what shall we say concerning the freedom, the freely chosen lifestyle, the hieresis of the Christians? For we who hold these opinions have arisen in multitudes, in different climes, in every nation and region. And that for Eusebius was enough. The anti-astrological arguments propounded by Bardaisan acted, as it were, as the intellectual and imaginative charter for the distinctive brand of thin universalism embraced by Eusebius. Wherever they were, Christians were free to do their own thing. It did not matter how many were doing it. A small group, let us say, for instance, the Christian church in Dura Europos, around 250, one cult site among 15 others in a small garrison city perched on the banks of the Euphrates, in a building with a room for only a maximum of 60 persons. This was enough to show that in any corner of the world, the power of the stars and its dark shadow, the imagined immobility of local custom, and hence of local pagan worship, had been broken. But there was more to it than this. The new freedom shown by the existence of widespread Christian communities revealed in the here and now the lifting of a mighty, invisible weight that had cramped the freedom of the human race. Put very briefly, Eusebius shared with Origen, and with Origen's pagan sparring partner, the philosopher Celsus, a view that placed local custom in the hands of mysterious heavenly powers. As Celsus, the pagan philosopher, wrote, "Each nation follows its traditional customs, whatever kind may happen to be established. This situation seems to have come about not only because it came into the head of different people to think differently and because it's necessary to preserve established social conventions, but also because it is probable that from the beginning the different parts of the earth were allotted to different divine or angelic overseers, and are governed in this way by having been divided between certain overseeing authorities. In fact, the practices done by each nation are right when they are done in the way that pleases the overseers, and so it is impious to abandon the customs that have existed in each locality from the very beginning." Now, far from dismissing this view, Origen showed that he shared it. He opined that Celsus's reference to divinely appointed overseers was merely a misunderstanding, a garbled echo of certain very mysterious truths that had been expressed in the Hebrew Bible. He referred to Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Lord divided the nations, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. But he then pointed out that Celsus did not understand that the majority of these overseers were far from being benign guides. They were fallen angels, demons no less, who had somehow usurped the powers of the angels who had originally been allotted to the nations by God. It was they who now tyrannized the earth. It was through their guidance that the human race had sunk ever deeper into the toils of idolatry and other forms of pagan cult. It was to conquer these powers that Christ had descended to earth. The notion of the re-establishment of the rule of the good angels, or better still, their replacement by Christ alone, was treated by Eusebius as the sine qua non for the expansion of Christianity on earth. His interpretation of the end of the temptation of Christ in the wilderness, "And behold, angels came and ministered to him," Matthew 4:11, conjures up for him the scene of Byzantine grandeur, as the angels of the nations came to pay homage to Christ, their true emperor. And he came too as an overseer to his own angels, who were first set over the nations. Those then being his own angels he thus received, but those who both visibly and invisibly tyrannized over those who dwelt on the earth, he put to flight with mighty and divine power. For Eusebius, the rule of the devil was over. The gods had begun to die. Eusebius ransacked the literature of previous centuries to find stories of their passing. The cry of the death of Pan had been heard by those passing the island of Paxos as they sailed to Rome. At the same time, great storms and howling wind had been observed by a Roman naval expedition as it scouted the North Atlantic coast of Scotland as far as the Orkney Islands. The natives told the Romans that a local demon had died. Eusebius drew attention to the date of this account. It had happened in the reign of Tiberius. That is, just after Christ had won his victory over the devil in the wilderness. Such events, followed by the seemingly instantaneous spread of the gospel, borne by apostles to the ends of the earth, showed conclusively, he says, that a strange and divine being has sojourned in our humanity. The invisible empire of the gods had been swept away as if it were a stage set removed by a mechanical device. Eich be hafokia de makana, to use the brusque words of the Syriac translation of his Theophania, just like a stage set. It's important that we should do justice, I think, to the solidity of this imaginative structure in the Christianity of Eusebius, alien though it may seem to most of us. For it placed the weight of expectations for the victory of the Church on a rather different foot from that to which we're accustomed. It is the back foot. What matters is not the forward step of a Christianity destined to a glorious future on earth. Rather, what Eusebius conveys is the sense that the present progress of Christianity is no more than, as it were, the aftershock of an earthquake that had changed the substratum of the visible world many centuries before. The progress of the Church on earth was the realization of a far greater triumph already won in heaven. Hence a view of history which is often disorientating to us. To take one small but revealing example, if we were to fix a date for the end of paganism, I think we'd be unlikely to pick on the reign of Hadrian. Yet this is just what Eusebius did. For it was in the reign of Hadrian, he writes, when Christianity was already reaching its height, that human sacrifice was finally abolished. For Eusebius, human sacrifice represented the nadir to which the false demonic overseers had dragged the human race. Its passing made splendidly visible the definitive end of the invisible rule of the gods. So with Eusebius, we're looking at a view of historical progress where what we would call historical causality, a chronological succession of events linked to each other by cause and effect, is less important than is what I'd call a mighty doubling of visible and invisible. What happened on earth was, as it were, a direct aftershock of events that were happening or had just happened in the invisible world. Nothing shows this more clearly than do his views on the relation between Christianity and the Roman Empire. Faced by the empire, the history of Rome, Eusebius went out of his way actually to avoid making a direct causal link between the earthly peace created by the Roman Empire and the spread of the Church. Nor does he present Constantine as taking this chain of events to a further level through the definitive de-demonization of the empire. Indeed, attempts to trace crisp causal links between the history of Rome and the history of Christianity in the writing of Eusebius in such a way that the one prepares the way directly for the other, reveal instead, on closer inspection, a large fudge factor in his handling of this issue. And this is because I think what was central to Eusebius's view of history was not a notion of cause and effect, but rather this charged pairing of visible and invisible, and the direct flow of the one into the other. Like great pulses of energy, processes which had begun in the invisible world made their presence felt in the visible world through startling, fully visible events. Thus, the coming of Christ and the foundation of the Roman Empire are related because, in the words of Eusebius's Theophania, they come from the same pool. They are related as parallel intrusions into the visible world of the unseen energy of God. Now, where Eusebius makes this attitude most clear is not in his views of the Roman Empire, or even of Constantine. It was in the history of the Christian church itself. For here, the pulse of divine energy was most constantly present, and its concrete manifestations evoked the greatest wonder. For in the church, the invisible persistently and triumphantly attained visibility. The church, indestructible and unconquerable, suddenly appearing, remains the center of his view of history. It's a history of what one might call the visibilization of the church. Now, when we turn to Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, what strikes us is his accounts of the last and greatest persecutions which preceded the conversion of Constantine in 312, is that he presents this persecution as a conflict between visibilization and devisibilization. This conflict determined what Eusebius chose to emphasize in his account of the great persecution. Thus, the destruction of the churches, ordered by Diocletian in 303, gave Eusebius a magnificently concrete object on which to focus his sense of a remorseless battle between visibility and forcible devisibilization. By destroying the Christian churches, the persecutors had for a moment attempted to make Christianity invisible, aphanis. Through the rebuilding of the churches, Christianity was revisibilized in the most concrete manner possible. For this reason, the sermon which Eusebius preached in Tyre in around 315 to celebrate the rebuilding of the principal church of the city represents, in the words of Philip Rousseau in his thoughtful study, The Early Christian Centuries, it represented Eusebius's most famous essay in optimism. For Bishop Paulinus of Tyre had gone out of his way to visibilize the church after a dark moment of devisibilization. Paulinus had deliberately insisted, despite much pressure to find another, less contested site, on rebuilding his basilica on top of the ruins of the previous destroyed church. More than that, so Eusebius claimed, he ensured that the splendid new basilica was approached by a wide, flat courtyard. This courtyard was a memorial in itself, for its smooth surface, level with the ground, reminded visitors of the utter flattening of the previous church. The new church was to be, as it were, the relic shrine of a building martyred in the persecution. In this theme of visibilization, we can glimpse Eusebius's own view of the future. What he wanted was an exaltation of the church. his mental furniture did not necessarily include the idea of anything as grand as the eventual creation of a majoritarian Christianity through what we always call the Christianization of the Roman Empire. To claim that he did envision such an event is to read back into the early 4th century expectations of later generations. Victory for him was enough, and this was a victory judged in terms of the realization of goals that had filled his mind and his imagination for almost half a century. A widespread church whose sheer extension, though spread thin, had defied the power of local custom and flouted the benign influence of the stars. A recognition, if only through a few dramatic episodes, such as the cessation of human sacrifice in the age of Hadrian, of the fall of the evil empire of the demons, a church invisible and undismayed, ready for exaltation in this world. We must not forget that Eusebius was not alone in nourishing ideas about the future. A Coptic Manichaean document, which dates also from the age of Constantine, the Manichaean Sermon on the Great War, contains very similar hopes. As befitted an apocalyptic text which described a struggle at the end of time, the Sermon on the Great War allowed itself to be more unrestrained in its view of the future than Eusebius ever was. The daring Manichaean contemporary of Eusebius could even envision a time when the temples for the gods of this world would become a dwelling place for the elect of the Holy Church of Mani. At that time, the Manichaean elect would enjoy the position which the Magi, the religious leaders of Persian society, are in now. Eusebius never set his sights that high in his image of the future, but it's evident that the same wind of change blew through both groups. The Manichees also expected that a great patron of their church would arise. Under his protection, the elect will lie at the tables of the crown-bearing ones. Above all, the visibilization of the Holy Church of Mani would be complete. Here, exactly as in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history and his life of Constantine, the key word transliterated straight from Greek into both Coptic and Syria was parrhesia. Parrhesia, freedom to speak aloud. Freedom at last to be fully visible. For both Eusebius and for the unknown Manichaean author of the Sermon of the Great War, parrhesia meant above all freedom to be heard. Freedom to read aloud the great Psalms of Mani to groups of Manichaean devotees. Freedom to gather for ever bigger and better anagnosmata, for solemn read-ins of the scriptures in re-visibilized Christian churches. With the comparison of the mental horizons of Eusebius and the author of a Manichaean text, which soon circulated in Egypt, although it may have been first written in Sasanian Mesopotamia, we glimpse the structure of a particular view of what was considered possible in the immediate future that was installed in the back of the minds of religious leaders of the age of Constantine. This was their idea of what the future might indeed hold in store for them. Now, the $64,000 question, of course, is, was this the same view of the future as that which Constantine made his own in the years after 312? My answer is, to a surprisingly large extent, it was. The worldview sketched from the writings of Eusebius coincided in many significant points with the worldview of Constantine and with his own estimate of his future as a Christian emperor. But let me first reassure you, I do not mean that Constantine took his views directly from Eusebius. That would be absurd. But let me repeat that throughout his life, Eusebius had striven to be representative. He made use of ideas that were already in the air throughout the Greek East. As a young man, Constantine had breathed that air. Up to 305, he'd lived and traveled widely throughout the Greek East. And when Constantine turned to the west to take up his father's empire, he would have been exposed to views of Latin Christians that were not altogether unlike those of Eusebius. We can see this in the case of Lactantius. Though called a Christian Cicero, Lactantius' horizons were never limited to the Latin West alone. Indeed, Lactantius was what one might call a Latin Byzantine, of a sort who would become prominent in the 4th century. His career began and ended in the East, at Nicomedia, modern Izmit in Turkey. Though expressed in a very different idiom from that of Eusebius, his worldview was dominated by a fierce sense of the recovery of freedom after centuries of tyranny, both visible and invisible. In the words of Philip Rousseau, Lactantius, like Eusebius, saw his own times in terms of an increase in Christian liberty. But how did this worldview make itself felt in practice in the public attitudes of Constantine? Here I'd suggest that we adopt the metaphor of the cutting of a key. As we saw, the view of the future which emerges from a study of Eusebius is distinguished by certain prominent features: pride in the universality of Christianity, a conviction that the end of paganism had already happened, that what contemporaries were faced with was an empty shell, a mere paper tiger. And last but not least, a passion for the visibilization, indeed for the exaltation of the church. These stuck out like the teeth of a key. What did not stick out was a sense that Christianity could be established as a majority religion. That is a sense of vertical universalism, rather than the thin universalism which Eusebius treasured. Eusebius might acclaim the occasional rallying of an entire city, but the idea that all subjects of the Roman Empire might become Christians lay beyond his horizon of the possible. Nor was Eusebius unduly flustered when confronted by paganism. Faced by a religion which would not go away, despite the fact that it had been declared to be terminally retro, it was enough for him and for his fellow Christians to avoid it as much as possible. Like many other Christians, he fell back on codes of avoidance, not unlike those long practiced by Jews throughout the empire in their relations with idols, temples, sacrifices, and pagan festivals. Eusebius expected Christians to have a healthy sense of pollution when faced by the relics of this demonic Osseo regime. For him it was indeed truly terrible to touch an altar and to be touched by products connected with it. He described with great care how, when the ground beneath the temple of Venus in Jerusalem was excavated by Constantine in his search for the Holy Sepulchre, the earth was dumped at a distance from the site, for it had been rendered toxic by the blood of former sacrifices. He quoted with approval the remarkable passage in which Clement of Alexandria, seeming the most relaxed of Christians, spoke of the instinctive shiver of horror which a Christian must feel in the presence of a pagan cult, quoting Homer's Iliad, 3:33, 34. Just as a man at the sight of a snake starts back and trembling seizes his limbs. It's a reaction similar to the way in which, for the contemporary rabbis, I cite, the words of Torah, though they are as delicate as lilies, can cause a man to recoil from unclean things as if from the bite of a serpent. We tend to be unduly dismissive of this strong sense of taboo. In fact, fear of pollution was a merciful device. It focused attention on a few unambiguous and concrete situations which a Christian had to avoid. One had to develop an allergy for certain rites, places, and objects. But the corollary of this sharp sense of pollution was that pollution was not everywhere. One did not need to get hay fever allergies every one time that one read a pagan poet, attended an imperial audience, viewed a classical statue, or even when one sat with one's fellow citizens at the games. At the very worst, if these were drugs, they were, as it were, recreational drugs, which Christians were supposed to use with due care. By contrast, every good Christian was expected to know how to keep off the hard stuff. Now, a key cut in this particular way can open some locks, but it cannot open others, for they had not yet come within the horizon of the possible. In 3:12 to 3:13, they did not as yet belong to a thinkable future. And here we can return to Constantine, for it's precisely these uncertainties, these open spaces in the key, as it were, which intrigue us when we consider the measures of the first Christian emperor. We're faced by a puzzling shortfall between the declared Christianity of Constantine, coupled with his declared contempt for paganism, and the follow-up which such expressions seem to demand. We're dealing with the classic case of the mystery of the dog who did not bark. And even, which is equally surprising in an autocratic emperor, the mystery of a dog who barked but did not bite. Now, how can we account for these shortfalls? I suggest that these areas of shortfall occur in areas where we know from the works of Eusebius and from other sources, Christians were content with more limited horizons of the possible than we might expect. The issue of paganism is the most intriguing of these. In his utterances on paganism, Constantine made abundantly clear that he was very much against it. It was not without reason that his messmates had once called him Trachala, hard ass. Whenever the issue of pagan cult arose, in petitions, in legal cases involving sorcery, in the regulation of public ceremonies, he gave them a tongue lashing. He came down heavily on town councillors who had attempted to make Christian clergymen turn up at Jubilee celebrations in which sacrifice was involved. They would be severely punished if they forced clergymen who devote their services to the most sacred law to participate in the ritual of an alien superstition. As for those who wish to take the auspices in public in the ancient Roman manner, he was pointedly offhand. Bit like the Austrian phrase, jedes Tierchen sein Pläsierchen. Let them just go and do it. Go to the public altars, celebrate the rites of your custom. We do not prohibit the ceremonies of a bygone perversion to be conducted, provided it is done in the free light of day. Altogether, Constantine was a good Christian in the blunt manner that Eusebius and others had long promoted. He avoided the pollution of strictly pagan rituals, At the very end of his reign, he and then his son Constans were quite happy to allow the central Italian town of Hispellum, modern Spello, to erect a temple to his dynasty. It could, he said, be built with magnificent construction, but with the restriction spelled out that a temple dedicated to our name not be polluted by the deceits of any contagious superstition. This meant, in fact, that Constantine could have his cake and eat it. He could have his temple, provided that it remained clean of sacrifice. Constantine was content to place, as it were, a glacis between himself and pagan cult, protected by strict, rather old-fashioned codes of avoidance. He passed through murderous wars, visited ancient cities crowded with temples, presided over high ceremonies of state, surrounded all the time by non-Christians, but sheathed as if by a second skin, by the knowledge that as a Christian he had remained untouched by alien, unholy things. In answer to what might have been a pagan petition mobilized at the moment that he became sole ruler of the empire in 324, he gave the old religion little more than the right to keep out of his way. Those who hold themselves back, let them keep, if they wish, their sanctuaries of falsehood. To us belongs the shining path of truth. In the firm words of Timothy Barnes, this is not the peroration of a tolerant man. But then, what in the early 4th century is a tolerant man? Now, this is a difficult question to answer and laden with potential anachronism. It's time to abandon certain labor-saving platitudes. Let me share some good news with you. Not every late Roman Christian was necessarily a fanatic or a bigot. As Hal Drake has made plain in his wonderful book, Constantine and the Bishops, the notion of the inevitably coercive Christian as normative is a modern construct. It is the worst sort of conceptual anachronism. Discussing Constantine's own oration to the Assembly of the Saints, Mark Edwards is equally firm. We must waive the dubious premise that a religion must be intolerant because it is exclusive. But how do we reconstruct the notion of tolerance among early 4th century persons? To answer this question without anachronism, I suggest that we go back again to look at Eusebius. Put very briefly, so as to conclude, what we're dealing with is a view of the present and future role of Christianity that reflects horizons of the possible considerably more narrow than we might suppose. It is a Christianity with an inbuilt shortfall. It had not yet taken on the weight of a majority religion. If Timothy Barnes had told Eusebius that the first Christian emperor considered that his mission in life was to Christianize the Roman Empire, as he almost certainly would, the bishop of Caesarea might have simply looked rather startled. So massive a change was not what he'd meant by universal. Altogether, faced by paganism, Constantine and Eusebius shared a common view of the present and the possible future. It was a view that was perhaps mercifully myopic. It was enough to humble the gods by repeating on earth Christ's previous victory over the invisible empire of the demons. Eusebius rejoiced at the occasional, one might say almost surgical, humiliation of the gods in particular sanctuaries. For example, he hailed Constantine's dissolution of the sacred prostitutes of Baalbek. For such cults represented for him a small island of what all paganism had once been, an ugly enclave in the virgin forest of polytheism. In that case, Constantine's action merely echoed that of Hadrian in abolishing human sacrifice. Both actions showed to the world that the empire of the demons had already fallen. Constantine's spasmodic acts against pagan temples and rituals have usually been presented as the result of prudential calculations, the face of a restless pagan majority. But that, though part of the story, is not the whole story. I would suggest that Constantine's prudence was also bolstered by a worldview. Eusebius, and I suspect Christian public opinion in general, provided him with a majestic script of the pre-existing fall of the gods that lent a sense of cosmic grandeur to what was in effect a frank salami treatment of paganism. It was enough to take out the shrines of a few gods pour encourager les autres, to show the bankruptcy of them all. But these incidents are touched on by Eusebius in surprisingly random manner. By contrast, Eusebius went out of his way to quote in full the personal letter which Constantine had urged him and his colleagues to build bigger and better basilicas. For in such churches, writes Constantine, the divine power has been made plain to all. That was what both ruler and bishop intended to last into the future. The exaltation of Christianity, not the end of paganism, not the Christianization of the entire Roman Empire, was what deeply concerned both men. It was that which they hoped would last. So where does this leave us? It leaves us, in effect, with two middle-aged men whose worldviews had been formed in the late 3rd and 4th century. They stood at the very beginning of a century which, in terms of the changes that it witnessed, was one of the longest 100 years in European history. Their distinctive view of the future very rapidly became out of date. Faced by the course of late Roman history, we must at all costs resist the temptation to press the fast-forward button. Many scholars speak as if only a short step. Nur ein kurzer Schritt, writes Professor Girardet, and it seems even brisker in German, was required for the age of Constantine to become the age of Theodosius I. Well, it may seem a short step to us, but it was a step over an abyss into a different age, turned towards very different horizons of the possible. In the age of Constantine, no one knew that Ambrose, Theodosius, and Augustine stood at the end of the long 4th century. The world which would produce such figures was still unthinkable. By the end of the 4th century, things had changed. A future which Eusebius still painted in rather pastel colors had come to be blocked out in solid oils. Christianity could now think of itself as indeed a majority religion. Preachers such as Augustine could urge pagans to listen to the roar of the mundus, like a unanimous roar of an entire city gathered in its local amphitheatre. They should hurry up, join what was now presented by Augustine with little hesitation, not only as a world religion, but as the religion of the majority of the world. This amounts to much more than a matter of statistics. At the back of the minds of many Christian thinkers of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, time itself had changed. It had taken on a new, more sad consistency. It was no longer seen only in terms of the dramatic broken light of Christ's triumph over the invisible empire of the gods that was seemingly echoed in the dramatic on and off relations of the first Christian emperor to the ancient cults. In the grauer Alltag, in the grey routines of a world after Constantine, there remains so much more to be done. An entire society still remained to be digested. It was in the maelstrom of the long 4th century, and not in 312 and 313, that Christianity came of age. Whether one prefers grown-ups, with all their faults, to an imagined time of childhood innocence, just as often invests the early church in the days before Constantine with a false halo, that is an open matter. But the one thing of which we can be certain is that Constantine and Eusebius could not have foreseen what great riches, as well as what disillusionments and what perils, this maturity might bring. For in the words ascribed to Oliver Cromwell, he goes furthest who knows not whither he goeth.